thank you all for being here. I'm so happy. You know, one of the things is that we just finished the San Francisco theme last week, or I think. Was it last week, Abby? 2 weeks ago. It feels like last week to me. And so it's just extraordinary that all of you are out here tonight to join us again and kicking off the next giving season at the Battery. Our next theme is extreme poverty, and in this theme we'll be embracing the question, what will it take to eliminate extreme poverty by 2030? And so the first thing that, if you're like me, that you think is, whoa, that is a huge topic, and how do we as a small group of people here in San Francisco and at the Battery even think that we could take on such a question? And I'll make a personal promise to you, just after being in the research and the work, that over the next 3 months that we will find individually and collectively meaningful and tangible ways that we can move the needle on this issue and in the lives of people, families, women, and children who are facing extreme poverty. We will find ways that we can see that in really clear experiences. So that's what's ahead of us. Now, when we're thinking about extreme poverty, let me give you a little bit of a context. It's estimated that 1.2 billion people in the world are living in the conditions of extreme poverty, which means that 1 in 7 are on the planet are facing around a $1.25 a day experience. So if you could imagine 1 in 7 of us in this room would be experiencing extreme poverty, that's what it's like in our global community. And the thing about it is that the UN has actually, and the World Bank, have come forward and said that we are the generation that will change the narrative around this issue, that we're the generation who can end extreme poverty, but it's actually going to take a lot of strategic and collective action to do that. So 2015 is a special year in this topic area because the goal of ending extreme poverty by 2030 is being kicked off, and we're going to see that there's going to be a lot more momentum in the dialogue around the issue. And so that's key for us as we begin to learn so that we can join in the effort. Now, as we've set up the theme, we've thought about it in 3 contextual ways. First is rural poverty. So it's around 78% of people who experience extreme poverty live in rural areas. And what this means is they're facing chronic malnutrition, barriers to building a livelihood or opportunities for enterprise, and poor health. And so for families who are experiencing extreme poverty in rural areas, that can often mean that throughout the course of a year that they're experiencing food insecurity, maybe all year long or part of the year. And so that's something that we'll ask our experts about to share with us and to help us get closer to what that's like. Now, in cities, 80% of the world's goods and services are actually made in cities, so there's lots of opportunity there. And so you have a migration from rural areas to city areas, but there's a challenge. Competition for wage-paying jobs is high, and so what that ends up being is that sometimes the only suitable or best option for housing can be a slum. And so it turns out that today over 850 million people around the world are living in slums and facing issues in cities that they often face in the rural areas. And then there's another context that's actually been growing, surprisingly. Since World War II, displacement poverty has been growing, and at this point in time, 51 million people, I think at the beginning of 2014, 51 million people had been forced from their homes. So conflict actually causes poverty, and it makes it worse. And so this is something for us to really think about in terms of when we're looking at governments and states, nations, and the implications of conflict and how that affects human beings. And it makes it much more difficult for us to be able to reach human beings in terms of resolving these issues that are in displaced situations. So that's a way in which geographically and contextually we're thinking about the issue. Now, when we invited organizations to propose to come to Battery Powered, we asked them to focus on holistic and comprehensive solutions. So all of the organizations that you're going to see are actually proposing models that are focused on building stronger, sustainable livelihoods, gaining access to vital services, as well as social inclusion. So what does social inclusion actually mean? Sometimes it's easier to talk about what it isn't. So social exclusion is when people don't have access to the opportunities of the others around that the other people around them do have. So for example, how this shows up in this issue is in countries where women do not have the ability to own land, child malnutrition is 60% higher. So actually social exclusion is another cause of poverty. And so really looking at things way beyond income become a really important aspect of this. We have to look at the social context. And so those are my opening remarks and just giving you a set of things to think about of how we frame the theme. But actually, I'm so excited because the people that are going to speak with you tonight have way more to share about each of these issues. So I'd like to introduce our esteemed moderator. I'm very happy that you're here. Jane Wells, if you would join us on the stage. Jane is the CEO of the Global Philanthropy Forum as well as the World Affairs Council, and she's the Vice President of the Aspen Institute. Jane, thank you so much for guiding us through this conversation. I'll turn the stage over to you to invite the rest of the experts.
It's my pleasure. We're really lucky tonight because we're having, thank you, we're having three true experts who are changing lives every day. So I feel particularly pleased because they are also three friends. And if I had to choose three people that I'd spend the evening with, it would be these three. So we're very lucky. I'm going to ask them to come up and join us on stage. And Jacqueline Novogratz and Khaled Malik and Musimbi Konyoyo. I think I have more microphones than I need.
Right. Sorry about that.
I think the thing to bear in mind that some of you have probably we're very aware that back when the Millennium Development Goals were set back in, was it 2010? 2000.
2010.
The Millennium Development Goals were set. They were criticized for being sort of feckless, pie in the sky, couldn't possibly be reached, a gimmick. And I remember it was quite hard on the Secretary General at the time. He was given a hard time on the matter. But in fact, what turned out to happen was it was a way to organize our thinking and mobilize resources, and so much so that the goal of cutting in half the percentage of the world that was living in poverty was not only reached, it was reached 5 years ahead of time. And so folks in the international community and folks who are working on the front lines as well have this sort of new sense of what's possible. Buoyed by that success. And in fact, the World Bank has gone so far as to say, okay, our next task will be to eliminate poverty altogether by 2030. And not only to do that, but to do that by improving the lives of people who are in the bottom 40% of the economic ladder. And that's extremely important to focus on because without this latter goal, I don't believe you could achieve the former. Because we are well aware that economic growth alone doesn't solve all problems, that GDP is an average that doesn't tell you much about development. So these are ambitious goals. They'll soon be embraced as well as part of the follow-on to the MDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, and we'll be off and running. So tonight what you're going to hear from Khaled Malik. Khaled was in fact the person at the UN who had perhaps greatest responsibility around MDGs and the SDGs. So he is in a position to help us understand what is possible. What did we learn from this experience and what's possible going forward? I'd like to also note that his wife Carter, who is a wonderful human being, is with us tonight. And they together are active philanthropists as well. Khaled was director of the UN Development Programs Office from, I should say, Development Report Office from 2011 until his retirement this past year. Prior to that, he had been posted in China during a time of extraordinary change, which could have covered any period, my saying that. And he was the head of the UN Development Program Evaluation Office. So you can see how he has a lot to bring to this conversation. Musimbi Konyoyo has really dedicated her career to the advancement of civil rights and human rights, and in particular the rights of women and girls. She's originally from Kenya. She's embarrassingly has got 2 PhDs, which makes the rest of us feel rather sluggish. When she was head of the YMCA's world, she was the world secretary general of the YMCA. It was when I first got to know her, and she and I traveled to Chad together to visit with women who were in refugee camps coming over from Darfur. So it was a pretty wrenching experience for us both. And you can imagine I was thrilled when she then turned around and moved to the Bay Area to join the Packard Foundation and then to take over the Global Fund for Women, a wonderful organization. And then the third guest we have is Jacqueline Novogratz. And Jacqueline is a pioneer who really created a model, and you'll hear about it. It was called the Acumen Fund. I think it's now just called Acumen, right? I want you to know the World Affairs Council has dropped council. So this is the trend out here. Watch out for your last name. It may go by the end of the evening. But you know, Jacqueline, she came out here to go to Stanford Graduate School of Business. So she can't be all bad. She spent her time out here as well as being a New Yorker. She founded Acumen, is it 2001?
2001.
2001, and it's a nonprofit global venture firm that finds small and growing companies that later become big and growing companies that focus in part on providing goods and services for the poor. She's a remarkable individual, as you already know, and as you'll hear. But I just have to read off what Nicholas Kristof said about her. He called her a banker, an aid worker, a bleeding heart venture capitalist. That went out. And a tough-minded philanthropist. And I should add that she's also a great friend. So we're going to start and ask each speaker to give a kind of 10 minutes, just quick window into their lives and the work they do and how they're seeing progress and where they see it's the hurdles. And then we'll go into a conversation. So Khaled, you get to start by giving a sense of what have we learned from the MTGs? What have we learned we can do? And bearing in mind that all the low-hanging fruit must have already been plucked, what are the challenges ahead with the SDGs?
Actually, Jane does a much better job than I would do. But I want to thank the organizers for inviting me and to get to know about Battery and all the commitment to helping others. Let's start with numbers. The person who introduced all of us talked about 1.2 billion people who are deemed to be poor. And that's by one definition. The number we came up with, the Human Development Report, the office I was leading, estimated 1.5 billion people. So why the difference? The difference is that if you think poverty is about lack of income, then that's the World Bank figure. But if you think that poverty is about deprivation, not being able to do things in a variety of issues, in the question of not being educated enough, or not being healthy enough, not having enough income, being discriminated against, then the larger number holds. And historic evidence shows that. Poverty went down historically, not just because of increased incomes, but better health, education, anti-discrimination legislation. And fundamentally, it's about empowerment. Individuals can do many things and be many things. And there are two names I would like to talk about a bit. One is Amartya Sen, who's a Nobel laureate in economics, a person who I've worked with quite a lot, and a friend of his, a classmate of his called Mahbub Haq, who actually started the Human Development Report, and the office which I was heading, he started it right at the beginning. And their basic idea was that development is fundamentally about people. So if you don't take care of the people, the economy doesn't take care of itself, society does not work, and the environment founders somehow. So the Millennium Development Goals, and I think a lot of credit has to go to Kofi Annan for being brave enough to actually make it happen. And there was a lot of, I think Jane is absolutely right, there was a lot of criticism and dissension about those things. But fundamentally what it did was to set goals for the whole world, but goals which are mostly for developing countries. There were 8 goals. 7 of them was about health, about education, about reducing poverty, and one of them was the things the developed world had to do in order to make the 7 goals work. Didn't quite work well, the 8th goal. Because it to do with trade, global negotiations, this is the reality of our times, are fundamentally stuck at many different levels, whether it's climate change or the trade accounts. But somehow we have to push them forward, because without that, many things will not work. Poverty in Kenya or in Asia will not go down if subsidies continue. So the connectivity. So this set of goals end 2015. There's a new set of goals, and they're called Sustainable Development Goals, because they're coming out of the Rio conference which took place in 2012, the second Rio conference. There was the first one 20 years ago. And they made a huge step forward and said, but life is all connected, so we have to look at economic, social, and the environment all together. Because it's not good enough just to have higher incomes if you can't breathe the air. It's not good enough if your ecosystems are collapsing, and if society is unstable because only a few percentage of the people are actually benefiting from it. So the sustainable work goals are hugely ambitious, and the idea is by another 15 years from now, by 2030, 17 goals, 187 targets will be met. So of course people say, my God, too many goals to remember, and they may be right. But the core issue remains the same. How do you make progress when things are connected? And that's it. And there are 2-3 things I would like to highlight. One, for the first time, the world is thinking about the goals being universal, not just for developing countries or developed countries, but universal. Clean air, clean water, a stable society, better income, poverty issues are actually affect all countries in different shapes and forms, and we have to address that. The second feature, which is quite important and difficult to get your head around, is these economic, social, environment are fundamentally connected. You cannot separate the two. If you have a poor business model which is producing so many carbon emissions, the world can't support it. By the way, I shouldn't say this, of course, in San Francisco, because quality lives are great, but if you were to repeat the average quality of life of San Franciscans, you would need 3 worlds for the whole world. So you have to find a way to shift to a more sustainable, cleaner world which does not spew out too many carbon emissions. So that's the Sustainable Development Goals. Hugely ambitious. We were just a week ago in Austin. There was a US-China summit with Bill Clinton, your former boss, and we were talking about these things. And what struck me was that the conversation on what are the responsibilities of each country and people have not been fully understood. And the US has a huge role to play. And I will just leave it as a thought, and hopefully one can come back to it. But there's another person I should introduce, a person called Maurice Strong, who's well known, who's 85 years. Maurice is actually the person who started the modern environmental movement. Rio Conference, the first one, he was the Secretary General. And he and I were headlining something about a year ago. And he said something which was very interesting. He said, the leadership of the world is failing us. So all of us, we have to become leaders ourselves. We have to take the responsibility of creating a better world. There's no other choice, because because of connectivity and social media and people getting better educated, each human being has an enormous potential to make a better world. Thank you.
So let me pick up for a second on this notion of leadership, and in fact, all 3 of you can talk. We'll return to leadership with all 3 of you. But the international community is going to gather in Addis. Is it in July?
In July, yes.
To take a look at how we are going to, as a global community, finance development. And we're going from talking about billions of dollars worth of development to trillions of dollars.
Yes.
So what is their assumption about who's at the table? Is this still just about governments, or are we going to see at the table in Addis, are we going to see philanthropy, private sector, et cetera, NGOs represented in part of the conversation?
Yeah, I think fundamentally it cannot just be the governments, because the traditional way of looking at money for development was looking at aid. Aid is but what, $130, $140 billion. The prospects of increasing it even a little bit are daunting. But what I'm really impressed by, the sheer range of new business models which are out there by young, very creative people who are trying to find different ways of raising money, of you must have heard of Just Giving in the UK, which is trying to raise money for campaigns and investing in people. But also people are trying to create the first People's World Bank, because their view is that solving problems is a bankable proposition. So all these people have to be in Addis, because only collectively can they raise the resources and the commitment to solve the problems, because it's not going to be a one-shot affair. It's a commitment for 15 years, maybe much longer than that. But the window for making some of the big shifts is actually narrowing, not expanding. Yeah?
Mm-hmm. There's another index, and that's the gender index. Say something about where are things right now? Because it seems to me that still men are making twice what women make around the world. So say something just about that measure.
In about 25 years ago, when the Human Development Reports got started, we created a new index called the Human Development Index and started ranking countries. And some surprising things happened. The obvious things you saw did not appear, meaning that countries with highest per capita incomes were not necessarily the highest in human development terms. So we then added other indices. One was on the gender, and actually the 2014 reports we introduced for the first time looking at gender disaggregated in terms of human development. So index for men, index for women, and trying to see which countries did better. And surprisingly, many countries in Europe do pretty well. But most countries in the world don't do it particularly well. And I think fundamentally when you are not engaging people in a collective exercise which empowers them and creates opportunity for everyone, you're depriving humanity for making all those adjustments you have to make. And I think in some ways I've come to the conclusion that education is really the key. I mean, of course, many things are necessary, but education empowers you and allows you to think, to be and do, as we say here. Capabilities get enhanced, and it's a huge opportunity to think through and do things better. So there are goals in the Sustainable Development Goals. I should have mentioned that one goal on poverty is to eliminate extreme poverty. So that's a global goal, which hopefully in September there'll be a summit meeting to agree to that. But there are also other goals on gender, on women's status, on quality of air, on oceans, forestry, things like that. We cover everything.
Well, but Musimbi will point out that, of course, it's at the role of women and girls will be at the heart of any development agenda. And it's not just about raising their status, it's really about them being partners in the effort to eradicate poverty. So Musimbi, tell us about your work and what progress you see being made and where there's still much to be done.
Thank you, Jen, and thank you all for being here. I would like to start just exactly where my colleague here left about the fact that gender has been named as one of the issues that we need to focus on in the development. And by the way, in the Sustainable Development Goals that are just about to be released, gender equality is going to be a standalone goal with a lot of indicators. And the indicators, of course, education is going to be one of them, because it's quite clear after the Millennium Development Goals that it was found out that for every 4 years that a girl stays in school, you have a lot of different outcomes that contribute to the whole national outcomes of a country. For every 4 years that a girl stays in school, she will delay the age of marriage, the age of pregnancy. She gets more skills, so the employability rises. She matures more in terms of both decision making and physique, and then can participate in completely a different way from what happens in societies, where the inequality and biases that exist for girls actually means that people marry their children at the age of 8. And when you look at maternal mortality, a lot of children who are mothers die. 70% of the maternal mortality is with girls who are below the ages of 18. And that's a loss in human resources. It's a loss on, it really is a burden on families, happiness is one of the issues for development. If you're going to do away with poverty, you increase also the happiness of a people. And it's just a lot of distress for families. So I can tell you, I was born in a rural village, farming rural village, where we had enough to eat because we could plant food by ourselves. But every week, I can tell you, a child died or a woman died, and at the age of 5, I knew what death looked like. I saw my classmates in school die. And today, as I talk to you, just 2 weeks ago, Zubeida, who was the remaining classmate, desk mate of mine, died. And when I saw her last, maybe about 6 months ago, she looked 3 times older than I look, and that's because of just the burden of work, the violence, the discrimination that doesn't give her opportunity to realize her power. Because poverty is not just about the lack of material goods. A lot of people can live with very little, but the lack of power. And in every society, when you actually go deeper, you will find that the people who are poor will often be either people with disabilities, old or young, or ethnic groups that are seen to be lower in a particular. So poverty doesn't just come unmarked. It comes very much defined within different contexts that have very social contexts. So when we talk about social inclusion, you have to go deeper into things that divide the societies. And gender is always high, because 70% of the world's poor, I think it's your statistics from UNDP and also World Bank, are women. So poverty has the face of a woman foremost. So what are some of the solutions? I work with the Global Fund for Women. And what makes me excited about working for the Global Fund for Women is that for the 3 decades that this organization has been there, right from the founders, they actually realized that if you're going to make a change in a particular place, the people that are affected need to be at the table, helping to make the decisions and deciding for themselves on what can be done about it. So what we do basically, we listen and trust the people on the ground. We have presence and have worked in 175 countries. We get data from UNDP and other places, World Bank, etc., of what is happening to the women. And we hear how they want to get the change that happens. And then, just like in the Silicon Valley and the whole of Bay Area, we are used to venture capitalists. The ideas that come from the people are exactly like new starters ideas. And we help to support them by connecting donors and the activists on the ground towards what will it take for them to achieve a gender equality that makes a difference. So they have addressed things like violence. 21 countries where we have had most activities have actually been able to have new laws that address violence against women. And recently, Stanford did a deep analysis of the work that we have supported. And they said to us that this has reached an equivalent of 1 billion women all over the world for the 30 years that we've been there. Now, if so many women can be reached to have the power, because we exist just to do 3 things: to ensure that women are strong, they can be heard, and they can be active to make change for themselves. So when they do that, they can decide to take their girls to school in the same way as they take the boys to school. They can decide that they don't have to have any part of their bodies cut for some reason or other. And they can decide that accessing the services that have come to them either through development or through philanthropies or through the government is a good thing for themselves. And when those services are not there, they can riot about them. That's what human rights is. That's what power is. When you can be able to know what belongs to you, and you can be able to accept it, but be part of forming it, and then ensuring that the whole of the community, not just about you, the whole of the community has access to those things. And that's what we call changing systems. And poverty eradication is going to happen when we can change systems. It isn't going to come by one individual scholarship given to me. My village still needs a lot more, despite the fact that people invested in my education, which I value, and I think is really important. But until everyone in that village has been caught by the systems changing and paying attention to them, we haven't eradicated poverty, and people are going to still die. There's a difference. I want to conclude by saying the difference there is. So I used to accompany my aunts and grown-up people to go 3 miles away to get water. The rivers have dried, which goes to say that it's a vicious circle. You do one thing and another thing gets open. What's happening to the environment is what is happened to our environment has really destroyed something. And when you look at rights, we have to look at that too as well. The second thing is that almost everybody in my community now, every family has a mobile phone. So what is happening right now, because of HIV affected many of our communities on the whole continent of Africa. And because of that, a number of possibilities like apps that are able to assist people to take their medication at particular time, and now those same apps are being used for agriculture, including in my own village, etc. I do believe that part of what we need to continue to develop is how we use technology also to bring a change. Last 2 weeks ago at the Global Fund for Women, we did hackathons in 5 countries, including Auckland here, India, Brazil. And just the result of these hackathons for girls was that girls were able to create apps that can tell if they are in danger so that they can ask for help, to create apps that are to assist them to get the kind of information that they could be forbidden to get, either by their parents or by their religious groups, because what keeps women is often cultures and religions and beliefs that women are inferior, etc. So what women are doing for themselves is going beyond and actually doing what I would like to call holy disobedience by doing something about it from the girls. And so developing things that they can be able to share information that is good for them and show them the security and the safety. And some of this can be used when women are in danger. We heard about conflict areas. And in many parts of the world, women in conflict areas are really in danger, and they can't also be active for the change that would improve their economic status. And we need to have changes in that particular area. And then finally, I think the last area I want to link with it is just resources. What can people of the world do? I think people of the world can find good ideas that are coming from the ground where the people who are poor are. Because there's one thing that you cannot deny from any particular human being. Everybody thinks, and their thoughts matter. And if we want to eradicate poverty, it's not about doing things for people, but it's about doing things together. Men and women, people who are poor and people who are not poor, governments and the public and private sector, etc. I believe that the only way to approach eradication of poverty is by collaborations of various parts, and with metrics that you can all align so that you can move in the same direction and move big in scale. Thank you.
Thank you.
That's great.
You touched on a very hard issue, and that is the fate of women and children in conflict. Say something about modern-day slavery, something that we like to hope doesn't exist, but in fact it does in so many, well, it does, and it even within our own shores. So say something about that.
There are many ways that I could come to that specifically, and I want to still stay with the frame of women because I think women are so important in the world. The other half of population, you see, of population. You see, when people are poor, they're vulnerable. So let me give an example. There's a disaster somewhere, and we all really run to make sure that we are paying attention to that disaster. But the people in that place are very, very easily vulnerable to be recruited for something else. It could be a natural disaster. And we found that in places of natural disaster, people easily get recruited either with a promise of a job somewhere or of a better situation, and some of them end up in situations that they are not planning to be there. Then we have the human trafficking, which a lot of people are very familiar. And human trafficking happens for many different reasons. It's not just about sex trafficking, which is famous, but human trafficking is for organs, for labor, for slavery, because in many of the trafficking, the people who are trafficked aren't always willing participants. They can be willing participants, and if they are willing participants, it's because they want to improve their lives, not because they want to be enslaved. But very often the end is being enslaved. The other side of this enslavement is, and I want to talk very honestly about this, is what sometimes happens in societies, like our own societies in the developing countries, where the gaps between also the rich and the poor is very large. And domestic people who work as domestic workers in the household and elsewhere very often have no working hours. Their pay is very, very slow. And so it's a form of slavery, too, that hasn't really come very high on the agendas of the world. But last 2 years ago, in programs which we also supported very heavily, the ILO, International Labour Organization, introduced a minimum pay for everybody. It was basically to ensure that those people who are working as domestic workers or who are working in farms or who are picking fruit that we all enjoy, etc., don't get underpaid and treated in a slavery kind of way. So there are many ways that could be able to explain modern day slavery, but some of it is just underpaying of people, trafficking of people, promising people things that they don't get, and when they get to the other side, they get a different way of being treated. All of this could go into modern day slavery. And then I would not want to leave out something that doesn't often get put into the modern day slavery, but I do believe personally that even recruiting children and taking children to serve in the army is an enslavement form. And a lot of women are recruited together with men as well and made as sex slaves by soldiers or by different people. And that's a slavery. It's a form of modern day slavery as well.
So let me just say, just add a word here, because so many of you come from the private sector, and you know better than those of us who don't, how complex supply chains have become. So how hard it is to really know your own supply chain. And one of the fascinating things that is happening nowadays is you're finding that folks in the garment industry, in the food industry, in the electronics industry are actually working with NGOs to help them identify whether there are any abuses in their own supply chain, whether there's forced labor in their own supply chain, so they can squeeze it out, so they can ensure that that is not part of their business. But it's something that happens quietly and is hugely important, and they're real leaders in this. In turning to Jacqueline, I'm struck by a theme that keeps coming up that we would, out here would call design thinking, right? And that is the notion of having the poor at the table, the beneficiary at the table, in grant making and in thinking through development. But Jacqueline, you always start with the customer at the table. So say a word about your model and say what you've learned in terms of what works and what doesn't over the past, since 2001, since you created this model for us.
Great. Well, thank you, Jane. And I have to say, first, it's wonderful to see so many friends here as well, including people who helped start Acumen back in 2001. Also, I've had deep respect and a long friendship with you, Jane. And it's my first time meeting Khalid and you, Musimbi. But it couldn't be more choreographed to see the interweaving of what you are saying. Not only the connection to Amartya Sen, who had huge influence and continues to on the Acumen model, but everything that you all are saying about dignity and about, as Jane said, design thinking, without using that phrase necessarily. And I actually started Acumen after, at that point already, spending about 20 years, first in international banking, primarily in Latin America, and then helped start the first women's microfinance bank in Wanda in the early 80s. And had come to the point where I started to really understand that on the one hand, markets are the best listening device we have, but they too often overlook or exploit the poor. And on the other side, we saw aid and traditional charity too often create dependency, which is the opposite of what Khalid and Musimbi are talking about, dignity. And that we cannot define poverty just in terms of income, and I had seen this writ large in Rwanda, but really needed to look at choice and opportunity. At that point, we took this stance that the best seekers, if you will, who were looking to disrupt basic service delivery, either from government or from the private sector, were entrepreneurs. But not just entrepreneurs who were thinking about how do I build a profitable company, but entrepreneurs who were looking at solving big problems of poverty: water, healthcare, housing, alternative energy, agriculture, education. And the idea was that we should take philanthropy, which should be the most risk-oriented capital that we have, but is too often where we see people taking the least amount of risk, and investing in these long-term solutions, giving them the time to learn who the customer was, let them fail, iterate, a lot of the stuff that you all do as entrepreneurs here in Silicon Valley, and that maybe we could come up with solutions that would scale either because the private markets would lift them or they would ultimately partner with government. And 14 years later, we've invested about $81 million or $82 million in about that many 82 companies, so $1 million per company. We've seen those companies leverage another $500 million into growing companies that are now serving about 125 million people and have created 60,000 jobs. So I didn't say that. I only say this to Khalid's point that we are looking at a world where we talk about the 1 billion in extreme poverty, but it's really more like 3 billion people who are left out of opportunity. It's really 3 billion people who, 2.5 billion people don't have a toilet. 1.5 billion people don't have access to clean water, electricity. 2 billion people have very limited access to clean electricity. And so when Khalid talks about power and sustainability and the kind of world we're building, what's been fascinating to me is that we see entrepreneurs who 10 years ago we would say marginal, cute, social entrepreneurs, and now we're actually seeing that they can completely disrupt systems. 2006 was a big year for us, apparently at Acumen. I didn't realize it at the time. Shafi Mathur, an Indian entrepreneur, came in and said that he wanted us to buy 30% of his company because he was going to fully disrupt the multi-billion-dollar, corrupt, bloated, dangerous ambulance industry. At that point, 90% of people in ambulances were dead. If you wanted to get your loved one to the hospital, you called a taxi. You wanted to get them to the morgue, you called the ambulance, and you paid a bribe for the honor. And so we thought, well, you have 9 ambulances, and we're working in Bombay, which has, at that point, 17 million people, now 20. It seemed a little quixotic. But we like quixotic. if you've got the glass-breaking entrepreneur with the vision and that we were willing to accompany them. This was not a private sector investment. Our philanthropic capital allowed us to take this bet. I was fully unprepared for the level of not just corruption, but sabotage and media plays and strikes that were played that the company had to endure. It had a very interesting pricing model and marketing model, which we could go into if you're interested. But long story short, today Zakitsa has grown to about 1,200 ambulances, 6,000 employees, serves 500 million people, half of India now, in their catchment area, and has taken 3 million people to hospital. Khalid mentioned cell phones, and Musimbi, you did as well. So now you also have a new kind of technology that's come on because we've been on this journey for 10 years almost with this company. We can now reach out to the customers of the ambulance company, not only to find out, did you pay a bribe? What was the quality of your service? Did you pay anything? But we can also find out what's your income level. Are you female? Are you male? Why did you take the ambulance? and have just completed a big study and found that in the 3 poorest states, which are the 3 largest states in which this company works, 80% of the people in the ambulances make under $2 a day. 70% of those people are women, and 70% of the 70%, so about 50%, are women on the way to hospital to have their babies. Most of them are having their babies inside the ambulances because now you're exposing the pipeline of hospitals which has such substandard care for low-income women. And so you start to see how the problems loom so large, but with the right entrepreneur and the right kind of long-term capital, if we can get away from just looking at the financial returns, which sometimes become a distraction, and really look at what it takes to use a combination of capital and then build an ecosystem around it. We've put in 8 different fellows for 1 year at a time to help build the talent systems in this company. We've helped bring in other kinds of resources to bring in marketing to enable it to build. You can really make change. I have 3 minutes. So you could tell we have 81 companies, so we could be here for a long time. But and so on the ecosystem side, we've actually moved from only investing in companies to investing in leaders. We have 300 fellows around the world who are doing extraordinary things. One is a young woman, Jocelyn White. I don't know if she's here tonight, but she was in our first class of fellows, went on to start IDEO.org. We are now partnering with IDEO.org to build online courses, because what happened was so many young people want to do this kind of work, and we can't hire them all. I wish we could. But so they asked us, well, can you take the fellows curriculum and turn it into material that we can use wherever we are in the world? And so we didn't know whether this would work or not, but as the 3rd level of investing in companies, leaders, and then the spread of ideas, we started these online courses. We've had about 150,000 people take them in 150 countries. Some of them are starting companies. And the most popular is design thinking. It is, we call it human-centered design with IDEO, and the things that we're starting to see around the world are just extraordinary. And long-term, I want to have a large global ecosystem where we can find these great ideas and help them move along until they become pipeline into which we can invest and then bring them all the way up the curve. I have 1 minute left, so I was going to tell you this whole story. Maybe we'll have time, because I do think that there's what excites me so much about the future right now, despite all the bad news. We work in Pakistan and Kenya and India and Nigeria and West Africa. We've just opened Latin America. All we hear is bad news. All we hear is the terror, the difficulties, and yet I really believe that we can crack some of these big issues that we face as a world, and I do think off-grid solar energy is going to be an unbelievable revolution. We've been lucky and almost accidentally to be a part of it, and again, we might have time to talk about it, not now. But to give you a sense of what we've learned, to Jane's question around why it's important to build companies from the perspective of the low-income consumer herself, rather than to just give something when it becomes very difficult for people to tell you why they don't like it, is, I think, illustrated in this one little story that's connected to a company called D-Light. We also invested in D-Light in 2006. It makes solar products for the poor. It now has brought clean solar energy to 50 million people and is a profitable company. And it's been a great ride. But a couple of months ago, I was in Kenya, and I'm going to visit one of the customers of this company. And the woman who ran the household was a grandmother named Teresia, a little tiny woman. And like many of these small houses, there was one window. It could have been midnight in the middle of the day. And she was very proud of this light, which also had a cell phone charger so that she could have a little business on the side. And even though she made about $1 a day, this thing cost $30, which makes you start to understand how the poor make decisions. Anyway, I happened to be with the regional distributor. It was this big Aussie, white shock of hair and big shoulders. And I said to Teresia, this tiny woman, why don't you tell Mr. Small what you like about the light? Easy in the charity model, right? She's going to wax euphorically about everything that she did. And she did. And I've been hearing these stories for 30 years. And I said, now why don't you tell her how we could improve the light? And she looked up at him and she put her hands on her waist and she said, well, if I could charge my cell phone at the same time that I charged the light, it would save me a lot of time. I think that would be a good improvement. I was like, good. I thought she was done. She wasn't. She gave 4 different opportunities that D-Light could take on if they really wanted to make the light better. And I thought to myself, watching this tiny man talking to this tiny woman talking to this big man, that she was neither pandering nor begging. But she was standing there as a customer saying, you want my business? This is what it's going to take. And he wasn't standing there with the false sense of certainty and the arrogance of so much benevolence that I'm giving you something and I hope you appreciate it. And then I come back and I tell my stories of how much people appreciated it. And I've not learned anything about them nor what works for them. He was trying to earn her trust. And in this interaction, they were equals. And in that transformation, I think is the real hope, not only for dignity for the poor, but for all of us. And that's the moment I thought, okay, this is why I started Acumen.
So I do want to hang on to one thought, and that is, here we're talking about a way to leverage markets, right? And we're a different way of financing poverty alleviation. But do hold on to the thought that philanthropy has a huge role to play in this. That Acumen does need this sort of patient capital, what you always refer to as patient capital, that gives you the flexibility to take a long view when you make an investment, right? And so it's not, I didn't want to lose that notion, because so many people are here in the room because they want to have a sense of the role that philanthropy can play. Or philanthropy as grants, as opposed to philanthropy in other forms of financing poverty alleviation. The organizers wanted us to focus on urban as well as rural, and I wanted to touch a little bit on agriculture. It's such an important sector in some of the poorest countries in the world. It's such an important sector for women. So many women are working land. Such an important sector from a development standpoint. And Jacqueline, to sort of start with a question, I think is it Mekelle? It's in Ethiopia. You've got an investment. Can you say something about that, and then I'm going to turn to
About
Cindy.
Mekelle Farms?
Mekelle Farms.
And it shows you where the opportunity is. This is 2 young American men who went along a trajectory that we often see, where they joined NGOs and found them to be full of heart, but not so accountable in the way that they were building systems. And so they raised all of $100,000 for their first impact fund. And they were like 24 years old at the time. And then, of course, they couldn't even pay themselves and have a fund. And so they were kind of bumbling around Ethiopia when this crazy opportunity came to them to start a chicken farm. And it's almost hard to describe, but they decided that they would take on this opportunity because there's really no working chicken farms in Ethiopia. However, the government had tried to do chicken farms for the last 2 decades. And so there were these 60,000 square foot dead chicken farms. And they were essentially, one of them was offered to these 2 young men for pretty much no money. And they decided to take the bait. And again, not right away, but pretty soon after, we decided to invest in them and went through all of the ups and downs of their having to try to import chickens from India and seeing all the chickens die and learning about the lack of distribution and trying to build a business model whereby they could sell 30-day-old chicks to farmers who would then raise the chicks for 6 months and then sell the chickens in markets so that people could buy egg-laying hens. And it's only been a couple of years that we're investing in it, but they're selling about 2 million chicks a year now. They're the largest by far chicken farm in Ethiopia. The government has just licensed two of the other major chicken farms to them now, and it has just been thrilling to start looking at the impact as well on not only protein levels but jobs. The last time I was at McKelly, I met a 22-year-old communications, a woman with a communications degree from college who'd been so just discouraged that with her college degree she couldn't find a job. And now she's a chicken farmer. She looks like she could be a model. And she said, I never thought I would be a chicken farmer. She sleeps with her 1,000 chickens every night because she's so afraid they might catch disease or get hurt. And you start to see the unbelievable multiplier effect, that this isn't, again, business for business sake. This is a business that can fundamentally start changing poverty, opportunity, one's expectations of how they can behave, and it will create thousands of jobs in so doing.
Ms. Simbevan, I keep thinking of a woman's role when it comes to farming and the whole issue of land ownership. Say something about that and what ownership might do to change a woman's situation.
Yeah. Let me begin by saying that it's actually recorded the world over that a majority of the world, actually, people who do the farm work are women. On my own continent, I think I would say probably 80% of the farmers are women, but they don't own the land. And very often the products that come out of that when they are monetary is not their property. It really is the property of the men in their lives, whether those are their fathers or their husbands, etc. So this whole issue of ownership is really important. But this is changing in some places where, with a lot of advocacy, there are places where women can inherit land. My own country is one of those, that women now can inherit land, including by law, because the constitution has been changed with a lot of advocacy. And that's one of the reasons why we really, in our model of the Global Fund, really go for the advocacy that will change to bring benefits to many people. Because I can tell you, it's so important that I can't give land to my daughter legally and nobody's going to sue her. And she can own it. Something that my grandfather couldn't have done for my mother, although my father could do it for us. So out of rebellion, but now he does. No man has to do it because of rebelling. But I wanted to say something about what we are doing. It's good men rebel too. I want to say something about the important things that we've seen really work for women in agriculture. The model we have really believes very, very strongly in investing in that woman, in the local indigenous women of particular areas. Because the model we have ourselves chosen to use has been, if change is going to happen, people in that place have to see models that look like them. And so we often see, and we reach places where women have really difficult, and indigenous women, like a woman who is indigenous in Chile or in Papua New Guinea, they really have difficulties getting resources. It's very easy for a woman who is educated like myself to go back to my village, and I ask all of you to invest in me, and just because we speak the same language, etc., you might find it very exciting to invest in me. But the model we have chosen actually is to saying, what about investing in my aunt or other women that don't have that access to the resources? And it's worked really well, because I was so happy when you illustrated that the ideas are there. But it is the fact that people don't believe that people who are not like, don't have a foreign language, don't have investment in looking good, etc., do have ideas. But they have a lot of good ideas. I would like say, for example, in the area of kitchen farming, we've funded a lot of women who are very good at farming chickens. Very good at, right now we have a project in 4 countries, it's just 4 countries, and we wanted to see what women do with indigenous crops. Burkina Faso, Uganda, Tanzania, and Kenya. And we started with $1 million investment that we got from the Gates Foundation. And we worked with groups to try to see, and we have a lot of data, to try to see, can they take traditionally nutritious food and grow them to a scale and sell and make a difference in their own, to their own income, as well as get themselves enough knowledge and skills to be considered as significant farmers. So after 4 years of experimenting with these groups and with the skills and everything, actually, they have gone beyond what we thought we would have. And what we need to do now is that we've waited so much appetite that places that we did not invest in, the control places, want to have exactly the same. We've seen the change of nutrition to the children in the places. We've seen that women are selling those products. We've seen that when they gather, they understand about their human rights and they show dignity. And the money they have used where they cannot inherit land, they actually have used their cash to buy their own land because they are entitled to that. If they can't inherit, they can buy land and own it. And that's acceptable. So they are changing the way that the community is thinking. I want to tell you one more story. Mary is a woman in the Philippines. There was a place in the Philippines which was badly affected by the floods. And in one of our investments, we got the women, because we really like people working in communities and thinking together, learning the skills together, going to apply those skills individually, but then coming together and thinking collectively to see how they can protect each other from the risks. So what they decided to do was to do vegetable planting with the resources that we had, and we had them learn about business, how to make a business case, how to sell your products, and how to produce enough so that you can be able to have food as well as do other things that you want with the income from it. In the whole of that community, which is several villages, they have the hotels coming to buy the things from them. They don't go hawking the things, which was the practice that was there before. That means that they are negotiating also the kind of prices they want for those goods. That's really significant. And the other third thing is that they have learned to actually keep records so that they can tell if they are making profit or not making profit. They are educating their kids. They are accessing medical help. So for every place, we've seen that the beginning was to invest in agriculture for women, but the outcomes have exceeded the areas where we were investing. And this is really important. So the power, the agency comes with the skills. You need the skills, you need the agency, but you also need to be able to find a community, because negotiating alone for prices doesn't come well. But when you can negotiate together, you really negotiate with the strength. So we found organizing and learning together. They have also been able to bring government to accountability by putting down the demands that make them to be good farmers. Because if they are good farmers and they are bringing products that are really good for everybody, even the government is happy about that. So they can make some demands at the government. And then, of course, their husbands respect them better when they bring some income back home. So it's this human rights and agency that is really important in this area. And we find agriculture as a really good entry to also for the human rights of women. And we want to expand some of the work that we are doing in that particular area, because it's innocent in one ways, but it also is the space where women can talk about their rights, begin from the right to food, and security and storage, because they also learn how to have the kind of granaries that allow them to keep the seeds to the next season and to have extra, to develop the kind of seeds that are suitable for their own markets, which is really great.
Mm-hmm. So I'm going to want to pick up on this concept of that kind of confidence that comes from collective bargaining, but also talk a little bit about non-cognitive skills. But before we do, Khaled, I didn't want to leave tonight without our talking about the things that make people fall back into poverty. I think we tend to look at this as a fixed thing. You know, they've come out of poverty, bravo, that's great. But in fact, there are all kinds of shocks that drive people right back in. And in fact, I mean, if you're thinking about displaced people and you're looking at what's happening in Syria, these are middle-class folks who half the country has been pushed from their homes. I read stories about some arriving with matching three-piece luggage, right? You know, these are people who were not in poverty, and overnight conflict drove them there. So talk about the things that can drive you back into poverty, and how do we protect against those shocks, or at least help people be sufficiently resilient to cope with some of these shocks?
There's a slogan which is going for zero. That's going for zero poverty. That's one of the Sustainable Development Goals. But there's important qualification, but also to stay at zero. So not only go for zero, we also keep it at zero. You know, the 2014 report on human development is about vulnerability and resilience. And the more we went into this issue, it became quite clear actually there are systemic issues one has to deal with. If you don't have jobs or you become unemployed, you suffer large shocks. You suffer a sense of loss of dignity, being part of society. And so we've actually pushed for full employment as an objective for all societies, not just developed or developing countries. It used to be the goal for society in the 50s and 60s, but somehow it disappeared from that. It's not just enough to look at Syria, which is a dramatic situation where livelihoods have been destroyed and disrupted, but in the way society is currently organized, there are large amount of insecurities which happen. Even if you're well educated and you have high incomes, you may not be a full citizen in your own country because you may be discriminated against. You may be part of a minority group, even a majority-dominated country. And the good examples are, if you are a Muslim in India or if you're a non-Muslim in Pakistan, you really feel the difference. You are not a full citizen in your own country. So these are the vulnerabilities people face. They become very extreme when your basic rights are infringed upon. There was a very interesting study done about India. And of course, as a Pakistani, I have to be very careful what I say about India. But there's a study which says between 1/3 to 1/10 is a big range of all the municipalities in India are undergoing through a state of civil war. Can you believe that? That's a huge figure. 1.1 billion people in India right now. And this is because there's a great desire for people to be treated with equal dignity and have equal access to social services and be able to, so it's known as the Naxalite movements in some cases, but in other cases as well, where minorities have been taking up arms to fight for their rights. So whenever you deny people of rights over a long period of time, at some point, people respond to that. And some take arms to seek recourse. There are some groups which are in Europe, for instance, right now. You know, the Roma communities have been in Europe for, 1,500 years. But if you look at any level, their life expectancy, the education level, the job situations are much worse than other Europeans. So that actually brings, I was listening very closely to very evocative things about entrepreneurs and ability of transforming lives. Development is fundamentally about transformation. But you need both macro actions, state actions, and micro commitments to enhance opportunities. You know, what happened in the US is quite striking. It's public education which transformed the US fundamentally. And there was a commitment by a state that every child should have an education. And that's what, so wherever you see a society which commits itself to providing public education for society and making 1 to 9 years compulsory for all children, you see a transformation. And then you'll see not only the 10 educated people who go out and become entrepreneurs and do great things, but then you see millions of people doing that. That's real societal transformation, real societal change. So you really need to fix two pieces of the puzzle. You need to fix state action, it has to work. And when state action doesn't work, you see the problems. And you also have to give people the space and the opportunity to find those solutions, and you have to bring them together. It's very difficult to only work on one piece of the puzzle. And there have been countless examples of people doing great things. But when it makes a big difference is when many people do great things. And that's the real test of, I don't know, I'm sure you people here in San Francisco look at this TV series on Silicon Valley. And every time a venture capitalist goes to pitch for more money, and the last sentence is, and we will then change the world. so it's great to change the world, but I think one has to do with a great sense of clarity of thinking and to really say the way to change world is to empower people fundamentally. And it's a complicated situation. There's no easy one-size-fits-all kind of solutions to it. People have to find own. But fundamentally, we are at a stage of history where people are connected. Even in China, over 600 million people are on the web. They put huge pressure on officials in China. The last thing you want to do is to be official in China right now because you're under scrutiny all the time. Some years ago, there was a train accident near Tianjin, which is close to Beijing. And the first reaction of officials was to bury the train. Now imagine burying a whole train just to eliminate any evidence of an accident. But people started filming it, and they put it on the web. And before you know it, 2 days later, the Prime Minister at that time, Wen Jiabao, was forced to go to the train, to that accident and promise a fair inquiry, which they did, and they put a lot of people in prison. So there is a movement which is very profound, which is happening. But you still have to invest in water supply systems. You have to you have to educate people. You have to build roads and transport infrastructures, and somehow that has to be done. Agriculture in Africa, believe it or not, per capita yields in Africa have remained static for the last 60 years. It's not that knowledge is not there, but the actions which are needed to just give the special pivot and transform entire regions has not been there. Ethiopia is interesting. It's about 80 plus million people, but has no agro-industry, which is remarkable. They import everything. Why? Because elites were very much influenced by the Italians, and they were very much interested in certain forms of food and which they import. So there's a whole system of things which have to change. If you're entrepreneurs, the developing world is where you should go. Huge opportunities. 80 million people need everything.
It's so true, not just in Ethiopia. I recently read a great line that actually written by a friend of mine who was lamenting that in the United States we're seeing a very small group of young entrepreneurs focusing on smaller and smaller problems for a smaller and smaller group of people. And when I look around at the people that are sitting in this room, I really think we need a new mantra of it's time to embrace the difficult, because life gets so... Thank you. I'm thinking of writing a book on this, so that makes me happy.
She's good at raising money, you can see that.
No, because you can steal it. You can steal it. Because life is so rich. You know, we actually... I come back from Pakistan, where I was just 10 days ago, and, you know, life is tough. And I come here, and the people are complaining all the time about these little things. I'm like, you know, come with me and see and work on these issues, because not just so then you appreciate your life, because this is life. And if we're going, and to pick up on what Khalid said, if we're going to solve these problems, it can't be, if I can't make a profitable app, it won't work, or it's got to be government. It's got to be all of us. And I would actually, Khalid, add to your, you said government and then space for people. I actually think there's an enormous role for the corporations. And we've actually, with ag, we've been investing now also for about 8-9 years in agriculture. And have seen enormous plays around agricultural aggregation, which means we have a cotton gin, actually in post-conflict northern Uganda. You buy from 50,000 farmers, and our particular company also trains them in organic and others so that they can increase their income. It's all a cash business, the whole thing. So the opportunity for oppression, corruption, slavery is enormous because there's no transparency. It's starting to change both with cell phone banking as well as for individuals that are moving into other companies. But what has really excited me based on all this knowledge is we've just made a partnership with Unilever, because you've got a visionary CEO, not an entrepreneur, a visionary CEO who says, if the world is going to change, companies like Unilever that sell 2 billion products a day have to really move from a shareholder-only model to a stakeholder model. And so it's so brave that they've partnered with us to invest in entrepreneurs who are aggregating large groups of smallholder farmers to supply Unilever along their own supply chain. It means that our metric will not just be we have built a profitable company, but have we increased farmers' incomes by at least 50% over the next 3 years. And this goes to your point, Musimbi, if you've got a major buyer on the other side like Unilever, you're much more able to think about bringing the kind of talent, skills, fertilizers, get other players with you to make sure that you are not only increasing farmer income, but you're getting them the supply that they need, so that other big companies don't only go to the large-scale commercial ag, which often don't employ the lowest income women farmers, but that you're actually working with the smallholders themselves. And I think it's these kinds of daring models that break out of I'm the private sector, I'm the government, I'm the civil society, and as uncomfortable as they may be, we have to get uncomfortable.
Yeah.
Or we're not going to solve these problems. And there's so much opportunity if we're willing to go there.
That's really good. Yeah. I want to put another view, which I think often misses in the kind of environments in which we are. I travel a lot in many of the places where all of us go. But one of the things I'm hearing from young people over and over and over, men and women, is that the press about corruption does not acknowledge changes that are happening in countries where people are saying no to their own corruption, or corruptions of their governments. We can't go on living and saying people in the local places are corrupt when people are also working hard. We have to get that press also behind us for us to notice the good things that are happening in countries. There are a lot of people who are really committed to being honest and doing important things. But I also wanted to put the other thing is that it's very difficult for people of the South to fight with only larger, well-known companies. And part of their voice is to be able to say these investments are good and working together is good, but really noticing that small farmers. I would give an example. In my country, the tea industry, the owners of the tea industry were small tea farmers. And because the government made a clear investment in small tea farmers, we are a very strong tea exporter, and those farmers really made the difference. So I think we have to really put a balance between how much investment in large companies and in groups of people who are also struggling to make a difference. The development will become possible when we can actually see the people that we aim to change, their own changes, when we will see change in their lives, and specifically the women in those places. I wanted to at least say something to the communities here. Part of what we've seen as being also very, very progressive in the work that we've done is investing small monies that are commensurate with the kind of people that are going to use the money. It actually reduces ability to corrupt, and women very often don't just misuse other people's money. Microcredit has shown that, but they put in a lot of their own money as well. So investing in women, we found it really very credible. We found that they add the money. We found that they are less corrupt. I don't say they are not corrupt, but they are less corrupt.
I'm glad you said. I'm glad you did that.
Yes, less corrupt.
I'm not
and
sure I want
indeed-
equality in that category.
And,
but-
but where my vision is and my dream right now, which I really would like to invite many people to join, is this idea of men and women working for gender equality together. And I have found a really pleasure here in the Silicon Valley, being able to engage with men who want to make a difference for women in women's lives, and women who want to hold hands with men to make collective difference. This is where I see the issue, the future for the development, and the future for eradication of poverty.
Yeah. So as we think about the challenge that has been put before us by the organizers, nothing modest, Britt, everything large. It is, in fact, a combination of some very small investments and very small grants, and then larger ones as well. And the big issue is just how do you affect systemic change, right? It doesn't mean that you take it from the beginning to the end, but that your contribution in some way contributes to that system-wide change. I think that what's thrilling, Khalid, about this world in which you're thinking about the private sector, you're thinking about the public sector, and as well as the charitable sector, is in fact there are more and more fora now for collaborative action than I've ever seen before.
Right.
And a real sense of the three sectors coming together around problems, really hard problems, like slavery, really, really hard problems, and a willingness to do that. And I guess my sense is that whatever solutions you find will have to have the attributes of each sector. Large intergovernmental agencies can set standards and set goals and mobilize resources, and national governments at least democratic governments bring a level of accountability and transparency. Private sector can bring about efficiency and scale. NGOs tend to be the kinds of organizations that Musimbi funds, tends to have the agility and the understanding of the community they're serving that the rest of us may not have. But finally, philanthropy brings a risk appetite and the capacity to take a long view. And those are really invaluable attributes. Without those attributes, a lot of the things we've been talking about tonight just couldn't happen.
Yeah.
So we're grateful to all of you that you would take all this time tonight to focus on these issues and to join with my three favorite people in the world. So thank you to them, and thank you to you.
Amazing audience. I'm so moved and inspired and ready to embrace the difficult. This is our movement. It begins here tonight. I just want to thank you all for sharing your insights, your wisdom, your experience. We are so grateful to have you here and so much more enriched after this conversation. It's been extraordinary. Thank you. And thank you for being a part of it. May 6th is organization night, and I promise you it will prove to be just as riveting because it's more colleagues of you all and peers who are going to come and speak to us. The proposals are in. I think they were in at like midnight last night or something like that, so we'll start our work in terms of looking at them and getting them ready for the membership. And I just want to let you know that Michael and Xochitl Birch, who couldn't be here tonight, but actually because they're doing what the invitation of the evening is. They're in Ethiopia seeing firsthand this work being done in the field. And I have to acknowledge Xochitl as well, who traveled with 4 battery-powered members in November to go to Bangladesh to see the work firsthand as well. So this is a place where we're encouraging each and every one of us to know people who are on the front lines, go see the work, and then find for ourselves how we can activate our generosity. And I appreciate all that you're doing to spend your time and effort to be on this journey with us. Thank you and good night.